great to be with you, fellow members of the Remnant. I've been the president of the Mises Institute for about a year and a half, and at the very first staff meeting, our director of development mentioned that we have about 7,000 donors, everybody from a $10 a month donor to people who leave us their wealth, some of their wealth in their will. And she was sort of complaining that 7,000 is not a lot. And I reminded her that Jesus Christ did a pretty good job with far less. And we consider ourselves to be a big part of the remnant. And so I was asked to talk about the history of and how it applies to medical care. And by the way, I always call it medical care because health care, I understand, is my responsibility, and medical care is what you do. I think that's an important distinction there. And so, I've written a lot over the years on this, and I'm going to spend maybe 10 or 12 minutes on sort of a historical background about monopoly, and then I'm going to make some comments about how it applies, one way in which it applies to medical care. And at the beginning of the American Republic, there was always a battle, sort of an ideological battle between the people who were advocates of the free market, freedom in generally Jefferson and the Jeffersonians, and their nemesis was Alexander Hamilton and the Hamiltonians. And what Hamilton and his gang wanted, as far as the economy, is they wanted basically political cronyism to rule the day. In Europe at the time, it was called mercantilism, but it's basically a system of government policies that benefit producers and businesses at the expense of their customers. And so they advocated high protectionist tariffs that would eliminate foreign competition. They advocated tax subsidies to selective corporations to give them an advantage. They advocated a national bank run by politicians. What a great idea that is, huh? Put all the money in the hands of politicians and operate it in secret. Of course, we eventually got that, the Federal Reserve. And so there was a battle in America for decades over these things. That was in the first 75 years of after the Constitution was ratified, and president after president vetoed almost all of it, beginning with Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. Andrew Jackson vetoed the rechartering of the national bank. We had an earlier national bank. They abolished 3 central banks before the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. The first one was the Bank of North America, and its currency was so worthless, nobody trusted it, that it only lasted a year and it was privatized. And then Hamilton got his way, and we had something called Bank of the United States. That was created, and it was equally disastrous. It corrupted politics, created boom and bust cycles, price inflation, and they did not recharter it. Then the War of 1812 came, and it was brought back and resurrected to help finance the debt accumulated from the War of 1812, and it did the same thing. It created the boom and bust cycles, price inflation, high unemployment. Andrew Jackson vetoed the recharter of that. So that's 3 times that we had a central bank monopoly of the money abolished after its performance, and hopefully it'll happen again. But the big victory of this group, the cabal, the Hamiltonian cabal, and by the way, the left has recently discovered that Hamilton was the real founding father of big government in America. That's why they put on this stupid play on Broadway about Hamilton, among other things, and keep writing books and books praising him and trashing Jefferson. But it came sort of to, they gained their great victory during the Civil War, when most of the opposition to all of this, the sort of government-created monopoly through cronyism, came from the Jeffersonians, and they were primarily Southerners. And when the South seceded and left the Union, the Southern Democrats were gone, and the Republican Party had its way, and they were the political descendants of Hamilton. And so we got the high protectionist tariffs. It went from 15% to 60% was the average tariff rate by the end of the Civil War. We got the national currency acts that monopolized the money and put big taxes on competing currencies, eliminating competition in currency in the world. And of course, we got the massive corporate welfare for the railroad industry. And that led to what the Jeffersonians always predicted would happen, massive corruption. There were even members of the executive branch who were imprisoned from this during the Grant administrations. And so that proved to be a big problem for the political insiders who wanted to create monopoly for the benefit of producers, politically connected producers at the expense of everybody else. And so they figured they had to find another way because they got caught. It was called the Crédit Mobilier scandal in the 1870s. And the other way was regulation, government regulation. We can do this because it was always about empowering politically active businesses who and then would sort of kick back some of the loot to the politicians. That's what it was all about. My old friend, the late Yuri Maltsev, who was an immigrant from the Soviet Union, when he first came here, he was actually a defector. He worked for Gorbachev. He's a defector. And when he came to America, he would tell me, the American government is the same as the Russian government because government is all about taking bribes. That's the purpose of government, is taking bribes. And he didn't see much of a difference between the U.S. government and his old government back in the Soviet Union. And so there was a shift in all this. Rather than just writing checks to railroad corporations, which is what they were doing, they got caught at that, and there was a lot of outrage over that. They had to do it more surreptitiously, and at the same time, they had to develop a rhetoric of public interest. They had to develop the public interest rhetoric. And so to try to bamboozle the public into thinking that things that are against your interest are really in your interest. And there was actually even a Supreme Court decision in 1877, Munn versus Illinois, where there's two brothers named Munn in Illinois had a grain storage business, and the farmers had a lot of political power at that time. And so they got the legislature to impose a price ceiling on grain storage. And it's just political plunder, just they're robbing the Munn brothers by forcing down the price that they could charge and not allowing the free market, supply and demand, to determine the price. And the judge in the case, the Chief Justice at the time, said, in effect, these aren't his words, that if you run a business that affects the public, you must submit to government regulation in the public interest. And of course, the government itself will decide for you what's in the public interest, not the public, but a small handful of politicians. So that became the modus operandi in creating monopoly for a long time. The very first government regulatory agency was the Interstate Commerce Commission, 1887, and it was put together to regulate the railroads, supposed to regulate the railroads. The first president of the Interstate Commerce Commission was a railroad industry president. And that says it all, doesn't it? And he had been a lobbyist for the railroad industry, just like Abe Lincoln, by the way. That's what Lincoln did. And the first issue he had was the railroads had what they called long haul rates. If you're going to ship my goods, my wheat or whatever it is, 1,000 miles, you get a better deal than if you're only shipping it 100 miles. So basically a quantity discount, which is very pervasive in the free market. It's a way of competing. The very first thing he did was to outlaw the discounts. And so the whole record of the Interstate Commerce Commission from that point on was always to eliminate any price cuts and make sure the price was always as high as possible. And so that's how it got its start. When trucks came along, the trucking industry, the same thing. The ICC ran a monopoly, a cartel for the trucking industry. They even had so many rules. Like one of the most memorable is that if a trucker goes from, say, Atlanta to Oklahoma City to deliver something, he had to go back home to Atlanta empty. And that reduced the supply of trucking services, and the laws of supply and demand tell you the price is going to go up when you do that. And then when airplanes came along, The Civil Aeronautics Board did the same thing. It was created in the 1930s. There were more airlines operating in the 1930s than there were in the 1970s. So the one thing they did a very good job of is reducing the number of airlines, reducing competition. Price cutting was literally made illegal. It was illegal to compete by cutting price, which is why the airlines competed by dressing up female stewardesses, as they were called at the time, like Playboy bunnies, and giving away free booze to business travelers on the flights, and food. They would give away food, alcohol, things like that, and because it was illegal to compete. And the Civil Aeronautics Board even started regulating the size of the sandwiches that they could give people when they were flying. So that's sort of the history of this. And then there's the public utility industries, the natural gas, electricity, and all that. How it came about that in most cities, not all cities in America, but most cities, there were government grants of monopoly. And the very first one was in Baltimore. And I was teaching at Loyola University in Baltimore at the time, and I used to use the Johns Hopkins Library a lot. It was right a couple of blocks away. And back in the day and early in my career, I was a library rat. And I actually enjoyed going through the books and sort of like a forensic researcher. And I ran across this book on the history of the Gaslight Company of Baltimore that explained how the government created monopolies in the utilities industries came about. And here's the example. In 1890, the Baltimore Gas Company contracted to pay the city of Baltimore $10,000 annually and 3% of all dividends declared in return for a government grant of monopoly. So it was a loot sharing scheme. Give us a monopoly, and since monopolies make more money than when there's competition, we will share the monopoly loot with you, the city government. And of course, that spread like wildfire. Other governments, state and local governments decided, well, yeah, that's a pretty good deal. It's a hidden tax. We don't have to vote to raise taxes, but and if the citizens complain, we can blame the gas company, the greedy capitalists that run the gas company. We'll blame them. And so that's how that came about. And so that's sort of, it's my 10-minute rendition of the history of monopoly in America. And of course, RFK Jr., when he wrote, I read his big book on Fauci when it came out, and I reviewed it on LewRockwell.com. Lew Rockwell is the founder of the Mises Institute, and that's his website. And the day after my very positive review of Kennedy's book came out, I was kicked off of Facebook. They said I violated their community standards for doing that. But there's big sections on what's called the capture theory of regulation that is in part of the economics profession. And it sort of argues that these regulatory agencies started out with good purposes, but then they were captured by industry. That's not the story. It was industry that wanted these government regulatory agencies in the first place. There was no capturing that went on, even though that's what it's called, as far as that goes. And so that's my brief overview of some aspects of where this comes from. Now, as far as interventionism in medical care, Keith's great speech he was right when he talked about how the AMA from the very beginning was a political organization aimed at monopolizing the practice of medicine. And they began very early with occupational licensing laws. And in fact, I don't know if you're familiar with the Institute for Justice, but there's this organization that's been around for, 35 years or so at least, called the Institute for Justice. And it started out by suing state and local governments for occupational licensing laws that deprive people in all sorts of occupations the right to earn a living in doing one thing or another. So you might want to look that up and do a little research and see what they're about, because a lot of it does have to do with medical care. Early in my career, when I was an assistant professor at George Mason University, one of my first jobs out of graduate school, I had written about this, and a group of nurses came to my office at George Mason and said they wanted to start a home health care business. They were tired of working in the hospital, and they needed a certificate of need. And so I went to a hearing. They had a hearing on this, and I made the case for why they should be allowed to have their home health care business. And the people on the hearing board, as Keith said, they were people from the Fairfax County Hospital who ran their own home health care business. And naturally, they didn't want competition, and the same sort of thing happened. So this has been going on for a long time. And as Keith said, the AMA's first job was to reduce the number of medical schools by lobbying state governments to do that. And the founder of the AMA, Nathan Davis, prohibited black people and women from becoming members of the AMA. And besides being sort of odious discrimination, the economic aspect of that, well, that's fewer doctors. You don't allow women and black people to be doctors. And Keith also mentioned the Flexner Report, 1906, which the AMA used with the help of the Carnegie Foundation. Something, by the way, that Andrew Carnegie himself would have been dead opposed to. But these foundations are often taken over by people who would think very differently from the founders of the thing. And Abraham Flexner had no medical training, no education in science. He had an undergraduate degree in classics, and he taught Greek and Roman history at the high school level. So who would be better qualified to evaluate every medical school in the country than Abraham Flexner? He did have two brothers, however, who were doctors. And I would bet at least $1 that they were active in the American Medical Association at the time. And so they announced there's too many doctors, too many hospitals, only men could be admitted to the profession. All the alternative approaches were banned, and a classic monopoly scheme from the very beginning is the so-called Flexner Report. He graduated from Johns Hopkins, and they wanted every medical school in the country to be just like that, no competition at all, just like that model, and they wanted to use the coercive powers of government to force that. The insurance companies originally refused to sell insurance because of what economists call the adverse selection problem. That is, older people with medical issues would buy the insurance, but young, healthy people would not. And so it would basically be prepaid health care at best, not real insurance. And at the time, there were something called fraternal societies. There were hundreds of them everywhere. And you would buy into this, pay a very modest fee, and whenever the breadwinner or breadwinners became ill and couldn't go to work, they would take care of the family. They would take care of everybody. And that's what existed at that time. What was called hospital insurance was established in 1929, and it was really not real insurance. They finally buckled under and started doing this, but it was really prepaid health medical care. It's not real insurance. And this was the beginning of the moral hazard problem. When they started paying for everything, it started giving people the idea that, well, I don't really have to take as much care of my own health anymore, because if I get sick, they'll pay for everything. I'll just go to the doctor, go to the hospital if I need to, and everything's paid for. And that was the beginning of that. Blue Cross and Blue Shield were granted nonprofit status, and that meant they were not required to hold any excess reserve funds for when they had exceptional expenses. And so whenever there was something happened where they had exceptional expenses, they would just raise everybody's rates. And that was the beginning of it. And community rating was imposed on them, so that young, healthy people in a particular community were charged the same rate as older people with more medical issues because they were in the same community. And so that was sort of another perversion of real insurance. And there's an old article that the late Milton Friedman wrote years ago. I have it with me. If anybody, I can give it away. Maybe I can auction it off, raise money for the organization here, called Input and Output in Medical Care. And he pointed out at the beginning, around this time, early 20th century, that there was a reduction in private hospitals and an increase in government hospitals. And then eventually, the private nonprofit hospitals became government controlled because of the Hill-Burton Act that said, if you receive any money from the government to build a new wing or to do anything, then you must do this and this and this that the government wants you to do. It started out with you must accept indigent care patients without insurance, but there are a lot of other regulations. And so hospitals increasingly during that period became more and more government run, government-owned and government-run or government-controlled, and they adopted, like government does, like the Pentagon does, cost plus pricing. So whatever your cost is, you just add a premium above that, and that's your profit, and there you go. So, why would you worry about cost cutting or holding the cost down if you're guaranteed a profit of whatever the cost is plus, some percentage above that? And so that happened in the hospital industry all during that time. And Friedman explains that. The big point of demarcation here, in my opinion, is during World War II, there were price controls that were pervasive on so many things, and businesses had trouble competing. There was a lot of competition for employees, with all the men in the army overseas. There was competition for employees, and so one of the things the businesses set upon is offering health insurance as a fringe benefit, and they got the government to make it tax deductible, and that's how it came to be that everybody pays for health medical care through the health insurance. That was the thing. And one issue that this creates is that that tax deductibility, that is always held as sort of a threat by the government. Do as we say, or you will lose your tax deduction. This is true of the churches today. For the main reason why almost every church in America went along with COVID tyranny is that they're scared to death of losing their tax deduction. That began in the 1960s with Lyndon Johnson. He signed a law that created that. And so that's why my friend Chuck Baldwin, who's a pastor in Montana, gave up his nonprofit status and tax deduction so he could speak truth to power. And he has a physician who's a member of his flock, who was one of the very first physicians to speak out against what was going on with the COVID tyranny. And as a result of her speaking out at his church service, which was live streamed, the hospital that she was associated with withdrew her privileges. So she had to send her patients to another doctor to have them admitted to the hospital. And that sort of thing was created by the tax deductibility. Okay. And then, of course, there are the hundreds of state-mandated benefits that insurance companies must include now. Now, Blue Cross Blue Shield, you became a nonprofit. You got the benefits of that with the years. But over the years, that led to a lot of government-mandated benefits where you have some states where a 60-year-old woman who wants health insurance has to buy a policy that includes pregnancy benefits. Things of that sort. The crazy stories are very numerous like that. My friend Hans Hermann Hoppe, who's also been associated with the Mises Institute for over 30 years, like I have, he wrote an article on this topic. He called it Hoppe's 4-step healthcare solution. And step number 1 is eliminate all government licensing requirements in the medical care industry. Hold your applause, please. Step 2 is eliminate all government restrictions on the production and sale of pharmaceuticals and abolish the FDA. That's a worthy goal, isn't it? Step 3 is deregulate health insurance. Genuinely private health insurance companies in the free market will insure against catastrophic illness and types of things under which you have no control. But there are too many things that are insured that you do have control over, such as your own health care, your own health. And finally, the 4th step is stop subsidizing the unhealthy to give incentives back, to restore the incentives of people to take care of their own health. That's a really insidious thing. I mean, you all know a lot more about this than I do, of people who think, I don't know, they think you all walk on water, I guess, as physicians. I'll just go to the guy who walks on water. He'll take care of me, and I can drink and smoke and not exercise and eat bad food and all that. They'll give me a pill for that. That's a horrible thing that has happened. And And so all of this helps, I think, and I really do believe that the direct primary care revolution that you're a part of now is going to solve this, is going to be the future. But these four things that Hans Hoppe mentioned, the more progress we make along those lines, the more effective, the more successful I think direct primary care will be, and that's just common sense. And I was thrilled, by the way, to see Robert Kennedy Jr. out there firing FDA bureaucrats his first day on the job, by the thousands. He has no ability to get rid of the FDA, but that's a darn good start, I think. And I think my time is about up, and so I'll finish there. That's my story for today, and I'm sticking to it. And I'll auction off this article by Milton Friedman for anybody who wants to give me a dime. We'll donate the money to the organization. Thank you very much, and take care.